So thank you very much for seeing us. I'm
Thank
very
you.
pleased. I've been following your work for several years now, and perhaps you'd like to tell us a little bit about your background. How did you end up being a historian with focus on oil and energy, and how does it all add up?
I'm now 41 actually, years old. I'm a Swiss citizen. So we're here in Basel, Switzerland, and Switzerland does not have any oil at all. We have no oil and no gas. And I started to research our energy consumption, the energy consumption of our country. And I found out that the largest part of our energy is not photovoltaic, it is not wind, it is not water, it is oil. So we import this oil. And then I started to research how much oil is there in the world and who is consuming it and how much do we need as humans, every day. And I was amazed. It is 88 million barrels that we need every day. And the barrel, a barrel is that thick, that high, 159 liters. So we need 88 millions of these every day. So that's 44 super tankers. I mean, a super tanker, that's that really big ship. We don't have them here in Switzerland, but if you see them, in Saudi Arabia or Kuwait, they're huge. So we need 44 of these ships every day. So we're all oil addicts in one way or in the other. And then I thought, why do we have wars like the Iraq War, where we've had in 2003? First we had lies, a lot of lies. Everybody knows now that, Great Britain and the United States were lying about the reasons, weapons of mass destruction, etc. It was all lies. And then you wonder, why are they lying all the time? And then I looked at the people killed in Iraq, 100,000 dead. And that's really what brought me to the point of saying we need to link peace, war, terror, and energy. We need to bring them together. Think of them. How can you get out of the oil wars and produce more wind energy, for instance, or produce more solar energy and be independent? Be independent. Have energy, but don't kill for it. Yeah. That's the main idea.
Yeah. And do you have any idea how far back does this go? This oil monopoly?
This goes back to 1850. I mean, I'm a historian. I'm basically specializing in contemporary history, so that's the last 100, 200 years. And if you look at the world population, in the year 1800, we were 1 billion. Today, we're 7 billion. So in the last 200 years, we have added 6 billion people. And then you wonder, why did we add 6 billion people in 200 years? I mean, we could have done that from the year 1300 to 1500. There we also had 200 years. Why didn't we add 6 billion? And the answer really is we had a different energy system. We didn't have oil, we didn't have gas, we didn't have coal, we didn't have nuclear energy. Those four are now the non-renewables that sort of support the system that we live in. And these four have different, problems. If you look at Fukushima, there's a problem with the nuclear industry. If you look at climate change, that's why because we burn oil, gas, and coal. So you have the oil wars. There's a lot of different problems connected with it. But on the good side, these four energy sources made us rich. They made you rich. They made me rich. We really have to be frank about it. They let the economy grow. They made it possible for us to travel to Paris tomorrow. If we want to, we can do it. And it was a profound reflection when I started to understand that this energy system has dominated for 200 years. And we are now in the transition to a new energy system where people will produce their own electricity on their roof, where they will be independent, renewable energy structures, and they will not consume any more war propaganda every evening on their TV news, but they will have their laptops and they will surf their internet sites at their own choosing. They will say, I trust this site, but I don't need to hear Rumsfeld in the Security Council telling me more lies. I'm fed up with it. I've met so many people who told me, every time I switch on mainstream news, I'm just getting depressed or angry because they lie at us all the time.
Yeah. But you're a historian, and isn't it very frustrating for you not being able to get the solid facts around this? whole thing?
It depends, you know. On some issues, we have very, very solid facts. Like on the oil consumption, that oil is the most important energy source for the world today. It is for Europe. It is for the whole world. Like this is solid. I mean, we know it's 88 million barrels a day. That is a fact. And if we look at the Iraq War 2003, we know that at that time, Colin Powell at the UN Security Council had a speech and said Saddam Hussein wants to develop weapons of mass destruction. He has biological weapons, he has chemical weapons. That is a lie. Okay, we know that as a fact. With Tony Blair at the time, Prime Minister in Great Britain, and he said, you know, we can have a chemical attack here in London within 40 minutes. That was a lie. It was a total lie. And we have the facts from within the governments. Like we know that, for instance, in the UK, we had the boss of the Secret Service, MI6, that's the British Foreign Secret Service, Sir Richard Dearlove. He said, the facts are being fixed around the policy, quote, unquote. You know, that is a quote. And as a historian, I take these critical voices from within the government who say, why is the Prime Minister lying? Why I, as, you know, boss of the intelligence community, know that it's all nonsense. And we can take these facts. So we have a lot of facts. Also on the other side, if you look at the US, before they attacked Iraq, Vice President Dick Cheney said that Saddam Hussein wants to develop a nuclear bomb just to scare people. He basically, you know, many people in the US said, oh no, I don't want another war. And then what Cheney did was he said, Saddam is going to produce this chemical, biological, atomic weapon, and he's going to give it to the terrorists, and the terrorists are going to make a nuclear 9/11 in the backyard where your children play. And then the people were scared, and I said, well, I don't want that. And it is on that level that we today have actually war propaganda. It's based on fear. And what we can do as historians, we can actually speak truth to power. Like we can sit down and say, wait a moment, we checked the facts and it's all not true. Yeah. And we have sources from within the US government. Joseph Wilson, he was an ambassador of the United States in Iraq. So he said, no, I don't think that's true, what Cheney's saying. And then Cheney said, well, you know, Saddam Hussein is buying a yellow cake. That is the material that you need to make a nuclear bomb. He's buying it in Niger, in Africa. So Wilson traveled to Africa, didn't find anything, flew back to Washington and published a piece in the Washington Post, I think it was. That was before the war started. And the headline was, what I did not find in Africa. Maybe it was the New York Times, I don't remember. But then Cheney reacted and attacked the wife of Wilson. That's the sort of Plamegate story, which turned into a movie later, and said, you know, his wife is a CIA agent, which was true. And the funny thing is that the governments, I say the British government in London and the American government in Washington, they are not solid units, okay? There's many people involved. And not all of these people agree that we should have resource wars now for the 21st century, every year another resource war. Some people say that's not right and these are lies. And as a historian, I listen to these people and I get such a lot of facts. I mean, actually, in fact, I have too many facts.
Yeah. When did you come to realize that that the mainstream media might be more of a propaganda nature than actually real journalism?
It started 20 years ago. I mean, I'm now 41, and let me think back. I was 20 when I started studying history at university. And, you know, I was going through the courses, just the general courses that you have, World War II, World War I, you have all the Vietnam War, you have the Middle Ages, you have the Roman Empire. I mean, you know, the classical teaching that you went through. I mean, learning Latin, doing philosophy and Aristotle, Socrates. And the main point was always think for yourself, be critical. That, you know, that was the teaching here at Basel University. That's the oldest university we have in Switzerland. It's 550 years old. So I actually took that literally. I thought they really meant it. I said, okay, think for yourself. Yeah. And then I started researching issues that were not covered at university. I had to write a paper at that time about the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And the narrative was the Cuban Missile Crisis basically was an aggression of the Soviet Union. They put nuclear missiles in Cuba. Kennedy, at the time President of the United States, detected these missiles and they said, that's an aggression of the Soviet Union. And when I started my research, I thought that was, the correct narrative. Yeah. And then when I was digging deeper into the issue, I found out that in 1959, when Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba, the Eisenhower administration in Washington decided to get rid of Fidel Castro. They didn't want him. So what they did, they asked the CIA to make an invasion in April 1961, the so-called Bay of Pigs invasion, which failed. And then I was going like, oh, isn't that illegal? I mean, I really was that Swiss history student at that time I was probably 25. I mean, it took me a few years to study. But I was going like, isn't that illegal? Why do they do that? I mean, that is the Secret Service. Can they go into another country and topple the government? I mean, that is the so-called West. That's Europe and America. That's the NATO countries. I mean, do they do that? Are they aggressive? And I went to my professors and I asked them, I mean, can you teach us more about secret warfare, about covert action, about the CIA, what they're doing? Are they really using LSD on people who don't know it just to see how it works? Are they really, I mean, is it true that they overthrew Allende in Chile in 1973? And the reaction I got was very disappointing. They said, yes, yes, these are important questions.
Yeah.
These are important questions. We can't deal with them right now. Because I'm specializing in something else, so I can't teach you about these things. These are delicate issues. The narrative is fragmented, so there's different narratives that what really happened, etc., etc. I mean, I was fed up. They just didn't want to talk about it. I found a few professors, very clever professors, who said, we can talk about it. It doesn't have to be, in class. We can just go on a walk. With one professor, he's a very, very brainy man. He said, I usually go on a walk on a Sunday in the hills, and if you want, you can join me. And I said, well, that's great. And we walked for like 8 hours, just, with a little picnic, and we were out in nature. And this man, he's very, very gifted man. I learned a lot from him. He told me, the system of power and power abuse, how it works, and how an elite always tries to maximize their profit, how they try to influence governments, corporations, the media, whatever. And at that point, I realized that I wanted to do my PhD on something of that field. I wanted to research covert action, and I decided for NATO secret armies. But really, as you say, these were all things that were not covered in the mainstream press, because I was always reading the Swiss newspaper. Nothing in it. And I was doing the university courses at Swiss universities. Nothing in it. This, like, covert action is something which every journalist or every history professor says, yes, it exists, but for different reasons, I can't speak about it. I don't want to speak about it. It's something which you can find on the internet.
Yeah. It's covert, so
yes.
Yeah. I also find it interesting. During the last 50, 70 years or so, the United States has waged a lot of wars in a lot of countries, and you connect these wars with you call it resource wars.
Yes.
But we were told it was wars about freedom, about democracy.
Yes, to help people.
Yeah.
That's the thing then that's the same in Denmark as it is in Switzerland. We were told in Switzerland that the West would never kill somebody just to take something. I mean, that is just, it is unchristian, it is immoral, it is unsocial, it is not humanitarian, it's against all values. We couldn't do it. No. So I have to say, I believed it for 20 years. Like the first 20 years of my life, I believed it. Now the last 20 years, I don't believe it anymore because I researched for myself. And when there were so many examples. I started, for instance, to research the Vietnam War. I mean, they told us the Vietnam War was fought because communism, which is something very evil, very dreadful, had to be stopped. Communism was spreading all over the world. It came from China and Russia, and they were going into Vietnam, and it's like a disease. I mean, that's the way I was taught. And then I said, yeah, okay, let's look at the data. And then I looked at the data and I found out, facts are, Vietnam was a French colony. The French went there to produce rubber. You can cut the trees, and then there's some sort of liquid coming out of the tree, and that is the raw material that you need to produce rubber at that time. Now there's synthetic ways, but at that time that was an important way. So they basically went to Vietnam, took something. And during the Second World War, from 1939 to 1945, France was occupied by Germany. So the colonial power itself, which had occupied Vietnam, was occupied. And that meant they were weak. They couldn't control Vietnam. Then I went through the history of Vietnam, and I found out that in 1945, the Vietnamese took the Declaration of Independence of the French. They took their own statement of, we want to be free, we want to have a democracy, and just wrote the constitution like that. And then the French went, you're kidding, you can't have that. That's for us, okay? We are a colonial power, and you have to give us our resources, and if you don't give us the resource, we just kill you. Yeah. That was the deal. And they sent their troops. And I looked at the data in more detail. I mean, I looked at the debate in the French parliament, where one part of the parliamentarians, the French parliamentarians, were fighting with the other group of the French parliamentarians, saying, we've just been occupied by the Germans. Now we've been liberated in 1945. And now we're talking about occupying another country. That's unmoral, that's immoral, that's just incredible, we shouldn't do that. And then the other part said, well, this is la grande nation, we need to have empires, we've always been a large empire, and we're actually doing this in Vietnam to help the Vietnamese. And then the other group said, well, are you kidding? Ask the Vietnamese what they want us, and they all say go home. So that's not, if you help somebody and he tells you he doesn't need your help, you should leave, right? And so I went through all this data, and then I said, so in 1954, the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu. So it was a military victory of the Vietnamese. The French had to go home, so that was the end of the colonial experience for the French, but it didn't stop there. In 1964, the Americans came, and they just continued their colonialism. And then I thought, well, why did they go there in the first place? And then I looked at the statement of President Johnson, who on TV said, we have been attacked by the Vietnamese in the Gulf of Tonkin. The Gulf of Tonkin is that bit of water, in front, no, I don't have the world map here, but it's just the water bordering Vietnam. And the argument that Johnson was making is saying, like, this is Vietnam, and there's a US ship, and they attacked that ship. So that's why I have now started bombing Vietnam, because you can't attack the United States just like that. No. And then I thought, well, is that true? Or is that a lie? And I found out it's a lie. It's a total lie. McNamara, defense minister at the time, later in his memories had to confirm that there was no such attack. Yeah. There was no such attack.
Bad intelligence, as he said.
Very bad intelligence, because the ship there was Maddox. The Maddox, that's the ship. And the first thing they claimed is that there was a torpedo, Vietnamese torpedo hitting the ship. And then later they said, actually, the torpedo just went close by, so it didn't hit the ship. Now, you will never be able to reconstruct a torpedo who went close by. No. But the way Johnson presented it to the American public was completely different. Exactly. And that was mainstream media. He used television and told everybody people were having supper, they were sitting at home playing with their kids or working in their office. Suddenly the president comes and says, today a vicious attack happened in the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, they had no clue what the Gulf of Tonkin is. They can't even keep Switzerland and Sweden apart. So, I mean, I'm sure they don't know that. But the important point is that he then said, I've decided to retaliate. Yeah. And then they started to bomb Vietnam, and 3 million people were killed. Agent Orange, everything. And it's data like this which has led me to the conclusion that it is important for peace researcher, and I'm very engaged, in this movement to have less wars. I don't like wars. That we look exactly at the lies, because we don't get this spiral of violence if we don't look at the lies. We must focus on the lies and say, wait a moment, that's a lie.
Another topic, you talk about empires.
Yes.
And it's like the empires have always been here on the planet, haven't they?
Yeah, they've changed. You know,
exactly.
Once we had an empire here, and then it decayed, then a new empire came, and then it decayed, there's a new empire.
Yeah.
Yes, it's
and
true.
for the last 200-300 years, it was the Dutch and the French and the Spanish and
the British.
And the British, yeah.
Yes,
and
European empires.
Yeah, and now it is the United States, or
yes,
or is it?
It is.
Yeah.
Oh no, it clearly is. I mean, the way we measure empires is who has the biggest military budget. Okay, today the United States. It's 700 billion per year. That's 2 billion a day. That's the Pentagon budget.
Yeah.
Biggest budget.
That's only the official budget.
Yes, it's actually bigger, but that's the official.
Yeah.
You know, I always take the official data from the Pentagon.
Exactly.
Obviously, you know, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, they were on separate accounts, and you should take them. Anyway, but that's the basic figure. Second thing that you look at with an empire is who has the biggest economy, just in the sense of gross domestic product, and that's the United States. Then you look at who has the leading world currency. Because at the time when the British Empire, you know, was the leading empire, the pound was the most important currency.
Okay.
And now today it is the dollar. And when you have a typewriter and you want to press pound, you have to go shift, and then you have pound. If you want the dollar, you have it directly. And that's the change of empires.
Yeah.
It is on your typewriter. If we were 200 years ago, you could print the pound directly, and you had to shift for the dollar. And you know, that can change with the euro or the yen or the yuan, you know. But always, I'm saying the currency that comes directly on your computer, that's the ruling empire.
Yeah.
And the third thing that I look at is who has the most military bases across the world, and that's the United States. They have military bases in Germany, Ramstein. They have military bases in Cuba, Guantanamo, now very infamous because of the torture issue. They have military bases in Afghanistan, Bagram Air Force Base. They have military bases in Japan. They have military bases in South Korea. They have military bases in the Indian Ocean, Diego Garcia. They have military bases on the Panama Canal. Obviously, they have a lot of military bases in the United States, where every now and then you have a soldier killing other soldiers because they go mad. But they don't have any military bases in Switzerland. We don't want that. Do they have military bases in Denmark? No.
No, I don't think so. Not officially, at least. But that brings another topic up, because the question is actually who's ruling this whole apparatus. And I know you've, as one of the very few people on this planet, have done extensive research on Operation Gladio, the secret armies of NATO.
Yes.
And to some extent, one might think that they were actually still operative somehow in some countries. Do you have any take on that one?
Well, maybe I have first to explain what Operation Gladio is,
please.
Because many people don't know it.
Yeah, please.
This was my PhD research. I asked colleagues in the United States and said, I want to spend 4 years of my time as a historian. That's, you know, at Swiss universities, when you do a PhD, you have to do 4 years of research on one topic. And I said, I want to do something on covert action, which is not well researched. And then they say, look at Operation Gladio. And I didn't know what it was. And I said, yes, this was in 1990 in Italy. The Italian Prime Minister confirmed, Giulio Andreotti, that there was a secret army in Italy and that it was linked to NATO, and that the CIA and the MI6, the British and the American Secret Service, had set it up to fight communism. And I said, oh, that's interesting. And then I looked at it, and I went to the Italian archives, because I speak Italian, so I could look at the data of the Italian Senate. And the Italian Senate, indeed, had made an investigation, and it was very interesting. The network of these secret soldiers was equipped with arms, with explosions, with guns, and they were recruited from anti-communists in Italy. Because the idea was, after the Second World War, NATO was established in 1949. NATO is the biggest military alliance in the world. It has now 28 countries, so it's US, it's Denmark, it's Germany, it's Turkey, it's Greece, it's now Poland, Romania, it's basically Canada and Western Europe. And this alliance in the Cold War was fighting the Soviet Union. And the problem that they had is that in Italy, for instance, or in France, you had the Communist Party. So people who, for instance, in Italy, had been fighting Mussolini in the Second World War, many of them were communists. Yeah. So when the war was over, the problem was that, the communists had a lot of prestige because they were anti-fascists. They had fought Hitler and they had fought Mussolini. But London and Washington, they didn't want the communists in power. So when the Italians in 1948 had their first election, that was the first election after the defeat of the country, the CIA was given the task to manipulate the election so that the communists don't get too much power. Because they feared if Italy goes, they vote 50% for the communists, then Italy would sort of betray the secrets of NATO to Moscow. So this problem existed until the year 1990, all through the Cold War. And in that period, there was a terrorist attack in 1972, which is an interesting case. I looked at this in more detail. This was just a car parked on in a small village called Peteano. It's a small village in the north of Italy. And there was a phone call to the police, and the Italian police went there, and people said, it's a car, we don't know what it is, and can you check it out? So the police opened the door, and the car exploded, and it killed 4 policemen. And then the police so it was a terrorist attack. And then the police received a phone call which said, this attack has been carried out by the Brigate Rosse, which was an Italian terrorist organization from the extreme left. So the whole state said, we have a problem with violence, and it's the violence from the extreme left. It's the communists, it's the socialists, and it's their militant partners. And so, people were scared of communism because they basically had this feeling the communists are carrying out terrorist attacks. And only 10 years later, an Italian investigative judge, so somebody from the law system, looked at the data again and said, wait a minute, this data has been manipulated. The explosive expert was somebody who gave false testimony. The phone call was false, it was manipulated. So this is a manipulated terrorist attack. And he found out that it had not been the Brigate Rosse, not the left, but it had been the right. It had been Ordine Nuovo, right-wing terrorist organization. And the man responsible for the terrorist attack was Vincenzo Vinciguerra. So he was able to find this man and put him into prison. And the man said, yes, I carried out this terrorist attack, but, and that was very interesting, he said, NATO has a secret organization. And this secret organization is designed to fight communism, even in the absence of a Soviet invasion, through manipulated terrorism, which would then be blamed on the political enemy. So the judges went, oh, that's all nonsense, and that can't be, and it's just a crazy conspiracy theorist. And so that was in the 80s. And in 1990, Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti was forced to confirm that a secret army existed within the Italian military secret service. So that's the Italian government, different ministries. And then you go to the defense ministry, and within the defense ministry, you have the army, the Navy, and the Air Force, but you also have the military secret service. And within the military secret service, that's all top secret, you have very, very low, very, very covered, a unit called Operation Gladio. Top secret. And he found out that this secret army was operative in all of Europe. Italian Prime Minister said, you have this secret army in Denmark, in Switzerland, which is not a NATO country, in Germany, in Greece, in France, in Norway. And the task of the gladiators, or the stay behind, as the technical term is, was to wait for a Soviet invasion. And when the invasion comes, to fight behind enemy lines. Yeah. And I've looked at the data, and I have to say, in all fairness, I understand that some people who were working in these guerrilla networks, they were very much thinking of the World War II experience, where Germany had occupied other countries, and they said, we must prepare. So I'm not saying everybody in these networks were terrorists. I'm not saying that. No. Some were conservative people who were just patriots. They wanted to defend their country. They knew that it was illegal because, you can't have a secret army. You can't. I mean, the government needs to know, and the parliament needs to know, and academics need to know, but they didn't know about it. No. So usually you shouldn't have a secret army in any country. Okay, but they said if we make it public and the Soviets invade Western Europe, then we're dead. Yeah. So I understand that. And then NATO took a stance and said, first they said, we never had a secret army, we're not doing guerrilla warfare. And on the second day they said, that was in 1990, we can't comment, what we said on the previous day was wrong, but we can't give you any further details due to national security issues. Mm. And at that time I said, I have to research this. And I wrote to NATO. I wrote to the Swiss ambassador at NATO, and he handed in my request, and it all came back, and I said, there's no such thing. And it was just lies. It's just lies. Yeah. NATO, if you ask NATO anything, they're going to lie to you. They're not going to reply to your question, and then they're going to lie to you. And the next day, you read in the mainstream press that NATO is a democratic organization. It's not. It's not. And then I wrote to the CIA and said, there's people who are saying that the CIA has carried out terrorism in Europe. And that is a delicate question, isn't it? Yeah. Because, Italian generals, they were on trial and they said, yes, we have had this secret army, and yes, we've carried out terrorist attacks, but the Americans have asked us to do it because they wanted us to fight communism. And they said the strategy is very simple. You just carry out a terrorist attack and blame it on your political opponent. Yeah. It's as if, if I took a knife now and put it here in my leg and then say, oh, you did it. You're a criminal. You come in my office and you say you want to do an interview and then you stab me. Help, help. Yeah. And then somebody comes in and you're like, I didn't do it, right? You're still explaining yourself while the police takes you away.
Exactly, yes.
And this happens so quickly. It's called false flag. It's like you use the false flag. And it's called false flag strategy of tension. You create tension in a country. And yes, this technique is used. I found it in 1953. Let me jump to another country, Iran. We come back to the oil issue. In 1953, the Iranian government of Prime Minister Mossadegh said, we want the oil for ourselves. That was a bad idea because the British wanted the oil. They said, we did the exploration, BP, British Petroleum. We need the oil for our army. We don't have any oil in Great Britain. At that time, they didn't have the North Sea. So they said, we have to overthrow the government. And they asked the Americans would they help. So the British MI6 and the American CIA overthrew the government of Mossadegh in 1953. And, this idea of nationalizing the oil, that was changed. And, the BP and Chevron and ExxonMobil, they got the oil. Typical resource. In the 50s. Yeah. Yeah. But the strategy of tension that I mentioned was used there as well. In order to create chaos in the country, they had people, they paid them to dress up as Muslims. They were not Muslims. And they threw bombs around, Yeah. And that was the CIA creating tension. And it's very... I sometimes tell my students, I could be a very good advisor to a dictator because I know how to abuse power. I've studied it. I'm not going to do that, okay? I'm going to support the peace movement worldwide. But I'm just saying these techniques might be used in Syria, they might be used in Ukraine, we don't know right now. But if they're being used, then it's just, you can throw a country into chaos and then come and say, hey, I'm here to save you. Yeah. Whereas in fact, you created chaos in the first place.
Exactly.
And that is, that's the sort of thing I'm researching.
Yeah, yeah. But do you think then, after 1992, when it was officially resolved,
closed,
yeah. Do you think they just went home and gave up, or have they regrouped or anything?
I think that Operation Gladio was stopped in 1990. So I think Operation Gladio is over because it was an operation to fight communists in Western Europe or a Soviet invasion. And communists are no more a danger in Western Europe. There's no communist party which will take over France or Italy or so. No. This is history. But I think they have started to like the manipulation technique. Like they said, It's very easy to pay journalists, they'll write whatever we pay them, and to bribe them, corruption. And it is very easy to scare people. So this is a very tiny elite who's basically said, it's great, it's great. We can use these techniques and nobody finds out. So they continue to use them. What they did is, if I stay with the history of NATO, NATO is now 65 years old. It's not the UN, I'm always telling people, don't confuse the UN with NATO. NATO is a military alliance. The UN is actually the World Peace Organization. I know it doesn't work, but it was meant, it has a good charter.
Yeah.
Okay, the charter is good because the charter says one country shouldn't bomb another country. That's a very good point. Now, back to NATO. I think they've just, continued to use the technique. They have enlarged the area where they operate, like NATO has become bigger and bigger and bigger. Although in 1990, then President Bush had promised to then President of Russia, Gorbachev, not to enlarge NATO. But they broke that promise. And in 1999, NATO bombed Serbia. And before they bombed Serbia, they said, we have to liberate Kosovo, which is part of Serbia. Before they did that, they said there was a massacre in Račak. And I researched that issue, and I found that the data is very, very unclear, to say the least. It seems that this massacre in Račak, 1999, was manipulated, because what they said is, this is the Serbian military who went to Račak and killed the civilians. NATO has come to help. That's the official story. Still today, you can find it in official newspapers. But if you look at it in more detail, you find, oh no, it seems that the American Special Forces, the Green Berets, and the British Special Forces, the SAS, so these are the top military guys, Rambo, so these are special forces, they went into Albania, bordering Serbia, and there they trained the UGK, the KLA, Kosovo Liberation Army. And these people then fought, in Serbia, in the province of Kosovo, because they wanted that Kosovo becomes part of Serbia. So, it's a struggle, a military struggle. And there were shootings, and there were Serbs killed, and there were Albanians killed. And they hate each other. And problem is, NATO was involved, they gave secret funding. So it's not Gladio. Gladio was finished in 1990. But the idea of training people, giving them arms, and then creating an incident, and the incident in this case was Račak, the way it seems to me, it's still unclear, I have to say, but the way it seems to me is that they took people from the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army, which were killed, and changed their uniforms and said these were civilians, and presented them. And presented them to the public, and then you had the German Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer from the Green Party, who said, this is too much, enough is enough, we now need to have a war. That was a complete surprise. We always thought the Green Party would not want to have wars, and that's nonsense. The Green Party, if they get the chance, they do a war. Joschka Fischer has proven that this is the case. And he went to war with NATO. They didn't have a UN mandate, nothing. And if you don't have a UN mandate, then it's illegal. Yeah. So that was a war of Clinton and Schröder and Madeleine Albright, and they had their war. It was all illegal. And it seems that the same technique was used. The strategy of tension, false flag manipulation. So my answer is, yes, Gladio has stopped. That doesn't exist anymore. But the technique exists and continues to be used.
Exactly, yes. What is your take on this binding a basic resource to one currency like the oil and the dollar in 71?
That is a very important issue. I mean, if you buy oil today, you have to pay it in dollars. Usually, that's the normal. If you look at Brent oil, which is oil from the North Sea, and you look at today's newspaper and you look at what's the price, it's $100 more or less And it's not euros, okay, it's dollar. And then you ask yourself, but Brent is the name of an oil field in the North Sea. That's between Norway and Great Britain. Why is it in dollars? What's the dollar to do in the North Sea? You know, that's Euro-centric, you know, Euro territory. And it's really historical, also a bit hysterical, but it is historical in the sense that the Americans have always said, we sell our oil in dollars. And they used to be the biggest oil-producing country of the world. You know, many have forgotten that. They were Saudi Arabia.
When was that?
For instance, during the Second World War, the United States was the biggest oil producer of the whole world. At that time, in 1945, Saudi Arabia didn't produce. They almost produced no oil. They were just developing their first oil. In 1859, the Americans started to produce oil. 1859. And at that time, the Europeans in Romania were also, you know, producing a little bit of oil, but they were basically digging it out with shovels, you know, very primitive way. The Americans were drilling for it. You know, they used a technique that they'd used for drilling salt and water. They used it for oil.
Yes.
That was very clever. So they started to build up a big oil industry, Standard Oil, and then the Europeans came in with Shell, with British Petroleum, with Total. And only in 1908, so just in the beginning of the last century, the British discovered oil in Persia, today's Iran. So the whole thing with the oil and the gas in the Persian Gulf, that's just 100 years old, okay? And for instance, during the Second World War, at the beginning, it was the Americans who supplied Hitler with oil. That's a very interesting thing. I've only discovered this recently, and I think it needs more thinking. But they could really decide who has a tank that moves and who has a tank that doesn't move. Because
exactly.
If you have no oil, you don't move an inch. And
so could you say that the attack on London, for instance, was a direct result of the deliverances of oil from the United States? I
you mean when the British were attacked by Hitler?
Yes, yes.
What I think the plan of Hitler was to actually conquer all of Europe and then attack Russia. That was his idea. And so he first took France, he took Denmark, he took Belgium, he took Holland. Italy was already, you know, fascist with Mussolini. And in Spain you had Franco, the dictator. So he tried to have England as well, okay? Yeah. Because England was otherwise in the back, you know, and he wanted to attack Moscow after that. And he failed, right? He failed. And the Germans obviously could have won against the British if the Americans had not supported the British with oil and had not supported them with material.
But when did this change happen from supporting the the Nazis with the oil and then to supporting the English, the British with the oil?
It is hard to say. We have to go back to the date. I know that in '39 the support was for both.
Yes,
for both.
And Prescott Bush was through his Brown Brothers Harriman Bank was involved in this financing, wasn't he?
He was. I don't know the details there, I have to admit, but I've heard the story many times. And what we see is that on the official level, you always have a narrative which says, we were always against Hitler in every way.
Yeah.
And then you go like, gee, but why did you give him oil? And it's like, oops. Well, yeah, we gave him oil. Everybody needs oil. And it's like, you are against him, were you? Yeah, but you know, he needed. And you know, once you start this, you know, people get very nervous or very angry. And what is important for historians to just remain calm and say, okay, let's go through the records. How many barrels did the Germans need? How many barrels did they produce? They were producing a little bit of oil in Germany, but just very little. And then I calculate how many barrels do they produce? Okay, I found they didn't produce a lot. It was not enough to attack Poland and everybody else. So I said, didn't they produce some oil out of coal? Because they knew the technique. Yeah. And I said, yes, they did that. And I went to the records and looked at it and okay, they didn't produce a little bit of coal oil, but it's not enough. No. There's still that big missing, and that came from different countries. It came from different countries, but it also came from the United States. Yeah. And then I looked at the situation with the Japanese, It was not only Germany which was aggressive in World War II, it was also Japan. People often forget that here in Europe because it's all Hitler, Hitler, Hitler. But if you look at Southeast Asia, you see that Japan started the war with China at the time, also with a false flag attack. You know, they blew up a railroad track and said, well, the Chinese did it in Manchuria. Yeah. And then the war. So I'm seeing this everywhere. You know, I'm seeing the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964 with the Americans starting the Vietnam War. It's just a lie. Then I'm seeing the Japanese, how they started. I'm seeing the connection of war and lies is very, very tight. It's not the exception, it's the rule. Yeah. It's called creating a casus belli. You know, create a story on which you can start the war. The story is a lie. And what I want to point out is that the Japanese, still today, they don't have any oil. Nothing. So when Fukushima exploded, you know, that they have 40 nuclear power plants in Japan, they said, okay, we shut them all down, which they did, and it was a good idea. But now they had to import oil and gas, a lot of it, because they have nothing. They couldn't say, well, let's drill a bit more, and then they have no oil, no gas. So in the Second World War, the situation was such that the Japanese said, we need the oil very quickly, and what we're going to do is we attack Indonesia, because there's a lot of oil in Indonesia. Used to be, you know, right now Indonesia has reached peak oil production, is falling, they've left OPEC. But at that time there was a lot of oil. So the Japanese attacked Indonesia because Indonesia, as it was a Dutch colony at that time, was easy to attack. Yeah. Because the Dutch, you know, were occupied by the Germans. Yeah. And so, you know, you see this resource game. And at the same time, the Japanese receive oil from the Americans, always oil tankers coming through over the Pacific. And at one point, President Roosevelt of the United States decides, we're not going to give any more oil to the Japanese. And then is a very significant day, because on that day, the Japanese oil tanker, which always went from Japan empty through the Pacific to the American coast, returned empty. Okay. It went there empty and it came back empty. And that's a very profound moment for the Japanese, who say, and you know, if you look at the data, it's very clear. They say, without the oil, we've lost the war. We need the oil because otherwise we have no planes that fly and no ships that run and nothing else works. So for them it was clear that they had to attack the Americans in Pearl Harbor. Yeah. Because they had to fight them in the Pacific, because it's the fight for resources is, if I have it and you don't have it, you either have to kill me and get it, or I have it and you don't have it. That's how it is. Yeah, it's very simple. Yeah. And that's why I think the Japanese decided to attack the United States. The reason being, the US had cut off the oil supply. And so that is the story before Pearl Harbor. Mm-hmm. And then comes Pearl Harbor. And there again, you know, Americans and also Europeans are being told, gee, the Americans were totally surprised that the Japanese would attack. But then again, I think that's not true. Mm-hmm. Because we can show today that the Americans were able to decode the communication of the Japanese. Mm-hmm. So they knew that the attack was coming. So they took the biggest ship, the aircraft carriers, they took them away from Pearl Harbor and just left some smaller ships there. And we also have a very important testimony of Don Smith. He was from the American Red Cross, and the President Roosevelt called Don Smith in his office and said, before the attack was coming, he said, listen, Don, we are awaiting a Japanese attack to come on Pearl Harbor. And obviously, you know, these people knew the World War II was all around them. You know, it was a brutal world. And then he said, well, then we should call our people in Hawaii and, you know, Pearl Harbor, take them out, take them home. Mm. And then Roosevelt said, no, we're not going to do that. What I want you to have ready is a lot of blood, a lot of insulation, everything. We need to have some sort of a shock to drag the American... That was the thinking of Roosevelt.
Is that on record?
What we now have is the testimony... I mean, Don Smith is dead, and Roosevelt is dead, so we can't ask these two. But what we have is the daughter of Don Smith, who has written to Clinton and saying, you know, My father has told me this. My father has told me this, and he has suffered, all his life from that the story in Pearl Harbor is not correct. And so we have, there's a few books also. Some books came out very early, like George Morgenstern came out very early, and he said it's an American catastrophe, Pearl Harbor. And the other one is Robert Stinnett, who argues that how the American government, provocated the attack, in the sense cut off the oil, cut off the information, have 3,000 die, and then attack Hitler. Because for Roosevelt, the problem was that many Americans didn't want to fight the war in Europe.
Exactly.
So I think historians are in two groups on this issue, on Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was in 1941, that's all agreed, and it was an attack by the Japanese on the Americans. Everything is clear, 3,000 dead, more or less. That is agreed, but they are in two groups. One group is saying the Americans knew that the attack was coming, and they let it happen on purpose, Lehop.
Yes.
I'm on that. I'm with this group, and we have data to augment our position. And the other group of historians who's also doctor title and written a lot of books, they're also very clever, and they think no, Roosevelt had no idea, it was a complete surprise.
Yeah.
So you will see that Pearl Harbor is an ongoing debate among historians.
Exactly. Which brings me to 9/11, because that's exactly the same case, isn't it? Either it's a Lehop or a Mehop, or
or a surprise.
There are three possibilities. But again, with the official narrative is that they were all surprised.
That's it. The official story is the surprise story. So that's why they call it a new Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
And they mean a new Pearl Harbor in the sense that they were surprised in Pearl Harbor already. They don't mean a new Lehop, because Pearl Harbor was a let it happen on purpose, as a conspiracy between Roosevelt and his chief of staff. Yeah. And now we have a new conspiracy. They don't mean that. They mean, the Bush administration, which used the term a new Pearl Harbor, they meant to say we were completely surprised. But what again, and these are American authors, who researched the case. What you have again with 9/11, you have American authors who say, wait a moment, there's something which is maybe not true here. Maybe it was not a surprise attack of Osama bin Laden, who sent 19 Muslims, among which Mohammed Atta is the most famous, to surprise the American government of Bush. That's the surprise story. But it was differently. He claims, some American authors claim, Michael Rupert, for instance, claims that the American government manipulated the attack, that they let the attack happen, saw it coming, let it happen, sacrificed 3,000 people, and then take resources and build a surveillance state, and listening on the mobile phone of Angela Merkel or what have you, and boost the Pentagon budget and all these things. Or the third story is no, bin Laden had nothing to do with it. The videos that we were shown were totally fake. There was never him. And it was the CIA and the Pentagon, so the Secret Service and the military, who've carried out an attack on their own population, killing 3,000. That would be more like Gladio, in the sense that, the Italian military Secret Service was really attacking their own population and blaming somebody else. Obviously, 9/11, 3,000 people dead, that's more dead, okay, so it's more delicate. But, as a historian, I always say, all three versions are possible. It can be surprise, it can be Lehop, it can be Mehop. Yeah. And the interesting thing is that many historians don't even touch the subject 9/11. Exactly. They say, I think, Bush is such a trustworthy source. It probably was a surprise attack. And I go like, why do you think he's trustworthy? Do you think he told the truth on Iraq? And they go, oh, no, of course not. Iraq, a dreadful disaster. There's just a lot of lies by Bush and Rumsfeld and Cheney and Wolfowitz and whom. They were a bunch of liars. And I say, didn't you just say that we should trust these people? And they say, well, it's just a gut feeling that you wouldn't kill 3,000 people. And then I say, a gut feeling, is that science? Look at the evidence. We can't just say we take a gut feeling. We have to stick to the facts. And the facts are, these people who were in charge, the Bush administration, have lied. They have lied again and again and again. That's a fact. Yeah. Secondly, they're brutal. They're really brutal. I mean, Cheney was writing editorials in the, I think, Washington Post saying why I think it's a good idea to torture.
Yeah.
And his argument was, you know, you need to torture because if there's a terrorist out there and he could kill children, and you find, you know, you happen to find his friend, and then you torture him, then his friend will tell you where the bomb is. Yeah. Okay, he made this sort of argument.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's just a very, very nasty argument. It's just the argument to say, sometimes, you know, it's good to torture. And I always tell my students, take your fingernail, just hold it here. Try, hold your fingernail a little bit. And now try to tear a little bit. Yeah. It's hard, you can't. But if you have tweezer, you could. And torture is if you just tear it all out.
Yeah.
And then think of the pain. And then think of, why could anybody say that's a good idea? That's not how we raise our kids.
No, right.
That's not right. So I'm telling them, they are liars. They are brutal. They attack Iraq, kill 100,000. What has Iraq done to the US? Nothing. There's no Iraqi who went to US and killed them and says, oh yeah, we had to retaliate.
But it was mainly the Saudis, wasn't it?
Yeah, the Saudis were more involved, but the Saudis have the biggest oil.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
And that's why we always come back to the oil. The Saudis and the Americans have been friends for a long time, okay? And we don't know exactly what the Saudis did on 9/11, but we know that Osama bin Laden is a Saudi, okay? And at one time, which is the so-called Afghanistan war, the old one, 1979 to late 80s, the Saudis and the CIA were supporting the Mujahideen,
yes.
which are the militant Muslims, because they wanted to defeat the Soviet Union. And, you know, some people today come along and say, what? Did they create Al-Qaeda? The CIA created it? Like students, you know, 20 years old, never heard anything of the world before, just watched football. Now they come to university and they start to research these things. And then I say, yes, you know, the idea was the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Yeah.
So they used militant Muslims in Afghanistan and defeated the Soviet Union. Yes. They thought it was a splendid idea. Later, these militant Muslims, okay, they were armed, and they, you know, they just went on to Bosnia and fought on the war there. Yeah. And later you found them in Libya. Now you have them in Syria. Yeah. They are militant. It's a problem.
Madeleine Albright has also admitted it, hasn't she?
Yeah.
That actually it was funded and created by the CIA.
Yes, that's a fact now.
Yeah.
And also Brzezinski, he was the national security advisor of Jimmy Carter. Yes. Jimmy Carter was the president in the US in the 70s. And Brzezinski, who is an architect of secret warfare all over the world. And he thinks it's a good idea because he has got his own trauma. He's from Poland, you know, and the Polish, you know, with the Soviets. And he's a traumatized person. Yeah. And he is now creating his trauma all over the world with doing secret warfare operations in other countries. Yeah. And he said, at the time when he was national security advisor of Carter, he said, why don't we support the Mujahideen in 79 already, before the Soviets came? Yeah. So they were building up the Mujahideen to drag in the Soviets to give them their Vietnam. And the journalist who you know, there was a French journalist who talked with him about it, he asked him, but Mr. Brzezinski, you know, there's thousands of people killed. Mm-hmm. Don't you have bad feelings about it? You know, people blown off their head, their arm, their leg? And he said, no, I think it was a wonderful idea because this helped us to defeat the Soviet Union. Yeah.
But the thought is this term of preemptive wars, isn't it?
Preemptive
strikes,
yeah.
And that was probably the first time it was used.
I don't know whether it was the first time. I think what is clear is that the Afghanistan war started in 79 with the CIA supporting radical Muslims and sending them from Saudi Arabia to Afghanistan. You know, making a difficult situation worse because the Soviets obviously saw that the Muslims were getting more and more radical, and they feared at the time that their Soviet Union, you know, with all the Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, these were all former Muslim countries, like within the Soviet Empire, they were atheist, communist, but they knew that they could fall apart if Muslim energy would sort of break them up.
Yeah.
And so they were very sensitive to the radical Muslim question in Afghanistan. And if you look at the data today, you see it, that the CIA funded radical Muslims. That's a fact. It's just a fact.
You talk about false flag operations.
Yes.
And if you look upon the wars being waged since World War II, all the South American CIA operations, almost every time it started up with some sort of a false flag operation, or at least a lot of times.
Yeah.
Then what about this ongoing war on terror? Do you think they also use false flag operations to justify this war on terror?
I mean, I always say the so-called war on terror, to me is total nonsense. I mean, what do you think? If you have a war on terror, who will win in the end? You destroy terror with war? Or what analysis is that? It is just on the semantic level, it is a no-brainer. It doesn't work. You can't, it is like the violence against violence, okay? You create a party and says, my party, the plan of my party is violence against violence to have, in the end, less violence.
Yeah.
And people go, hoorah, that's what we need, They always give you the salute and go, can we give you money for a tank or a missile? It seems like a great plan that you have. And this is so insane. I sometimes go like, do people believe the war on terror is something which makes sense? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. Because terrorism, if you look at it, it is blowing up a ship, blowing up a car, blowing up a railway station. Okay. So it is violent and it is wrong. Okay. I'm against terrorism. And what is war? War is violence, but on a much larger scale. Okay. With a war, you can kill 10,000 or 100,000 people. With a terrorist attack, maximum 3,000 or 10,000. If it's a huge thing. Or usually it's 400 or 200, or in the old days it was 4 or 5 people. Yeah. But that's terrorism. Yeah. So terrorism is killing primitively a few people. It's the weapon of the weak, okay? And war is killing many people with big, big guns.
The weapon
like
of
Hiroshima.
the powerful.
Yeah, weapon of the powerful. And one of the very profound and central insights of peace research is that you can't stop violence with violence. No. If you go and say, I don't like the world as it is, I'd like to have less wars, let's have one big war to end them all. Yeah. Yeah. One, just give me 10 Hiroshima, and I wipe it all out, and then we start anew. I meet people who say that. They say, I'm sick of all these wars and all these quarrels and all these fights. Why don't we just nuke them?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. And then I say, nuke them whom? Yeah. Your family or my family? Yeah, they say, not your family, not my family, but the others.
Yeah.
And I say, wait a moment, they're families too. Yeah. If you go and meet them, they have the same ideas like we have. They go like, I want to fall in love and I want to make some money and maybe do something interesting and find out, how a flower smells and climb a mountain and ride a bike.
That's life.
That's life. That's life. Yeah. And it's normal, I think, in life that we have conflicts. And conflicts are something good because we grow on conflicts. It's not something bad. But if we use violence in a conflict, like if a man and a woman have a conflict and the man says, I disagree with you, bang, shoots her in the head, that's classical a no-go. We shouldn't do that. Yeah. If our children, hit each other, what do we say? We say, don't, why don't you stop? We don't say, well, that's a small stick. Why don't you take that one? It's bigger. Yeah. We always try to de-escalate.
To reduce it.
And in international politics, we do the opposite. We start wars and we have media that report lies about it. And then we have people who go all crazy that this is a great war. Yeah. And I'm just amazed. So, no, I don't believe in the war on terrorism. I think it doesn't make sense. It started with 9/11. That's another thing. I don't think that 9/11 is clear. I think 9/11 has raised so many questions. These questions need to be answered first and cleared. So the collapse of World Trade Center 7 or other issues, these need to be clarified first before we start to accept a term which we don't understand. Yeah. Otherwise, we're totally brainwashed. Yeah. And if we're totally brainwashed, we can't accept a sane world.
One thing that puzzles me is if you look at the world history for the last 50 or 60 years, it's a fact that a lot of wars have started up with false flag attacks. I mean, we know the Gulf of Tonkin was.
Yes, we know. And I know.
Yeah.
But who knows?
All right, but people are going to know at least.
Yes.
And I've also looked at some of the terror events, the Boston bombings and others, and I'm sure you're aware that a lot of people say that some of them were fake.
I didn't cover it. I didn't cover it because there's so much violence going on. Sometimes I don't cover it. Sometimes I cover it. I don't know about Boston.
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
But just the thought of why should they stop using false flag attacks just because they changed the name of the war?
Yes, no, I think it will go on. It is a technique that is now used. You know, it's a well-known technique. But what I think is that what we also have is the information revolution.
Yes.
Now, what is the information revolution? For me, as a historian, it's a fascinating thing. It's something very nice. I like it. What happened with the information revolution? I go back, you know, to the Middle Ages, and at that time, Middle Ages go from 500 to 1500. At that time, you had a revolution, an information revolution. What was the revolution? First, people couldn't read. Like 90% in Denmark and Switzerland, they couldn't read, just couldn't read. Yes. And then some learned to read, but everything was in Latin, so basically no access to books. And the books were so rare because they had to be handwritten.
Right.
Every book had to be handwritten. Think of all the books down here, handwritten.
Yeah.
You couldn't pay for it. I mean, a rich man would have had so many books.
Exactly.
And then they invented the printing press. Around 1500 if you want, 1400, 1500, it doesn't matter. So that was the first revolution. And then fast forward to the year 1996, I think it was. So that's some 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. We have Netscape Navigator. Yeah. What is Netscape Navigator? Netscape Navigator, and the older guys like you and me remember it, right?
Right.
Netscape Navigator was an internet browser that made the internet accessible for those who were not computer wizards.
Yeah.
Okay, that's Netscape,
that's basically,
isn't it?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I remember myself. I was the first time on internet. I remember distinctly. It was in 1996. I was studying in Amsterdam. Great year in Amsterdam. Learned a lot there from the Dutch. And what I did is, first they said, "Hey, Dan, come along. We're all going to check out the internet."
Yeah.
That was 1996. I go like, okay, I come along. Like, you know, students, they always move in crowds. So the university had a whole library with computers.
Yeah.
And I went there. And then my friend said, "Well, you know, you can use that computer." And I was like, "Yeah, good." And until then, I had used computers, but just to type emails and to write texts. And my emails, they were yellow letters on a black screen. Mm-hmm. It looked like, you know, in the old movies.
Yeah, yeah.
And Netscape Navigator was with pictures. And, you know, you could use the links. I never used the link before. It was a revolution. Yeah. It was very slow. That's what I remember. The first website I looked at of all websites, it was Boeing. You know, I thought, oh, look at aircraft and look at, and then it would like, zzz,
yeah,
zzz. It took half a minute,
right,
just to load the starting page. But what I want to say is, we are now in the midst of an internet world which is going through an information revolution. Mm-hmm. That means we can now produce and redistribute information at a cost which is so low that you can't think of the Middle Ages how valuable it was to write books.
Exactly. Yeah.
And at a speed which is so high that no man in the Middle Ages with the fastest horse could ride from, I don't know, from Munich to Hanover, mm-hmm, just to deliver the message. Now it's Dick, and you know, my friend in Washington has it in 30 seconds.
Yeah,
and this is the information revolution, and it's a fact. It's not going to stop. And the information revolution will lead to more and more people having access to this knowledge, the knowledge of abuse of power. Okay. Yeah. Now, I am a friend of this development, but I see a problem. Some people who have never heard of it, they are just shocked. Yeah. Okay. First, they go in denial, and I've you know, with my students, I've really experienced this. They go in denial and say, "No, it's not true. It's all crap. I don't believe it. The world is a good place. Nobody would lie, and nobody would kill." And then next day, okay, they go like, yeah, of course, I know. Some people lie and some people kill. And so let's look at it. How did they do this and how did they lie? And the important thing is really to understand that it's only a very, very small minority which is involved in this covert action game.
Yeah.
It's not your neighbor. It's not your teacher. It's not your mother. It's not your father. It's not your brother. It's usually most people that you know by first name have never killed anybody.
Right, sure.
Ask them.
Yeah.
And
That's like I've always thought I've never ever met one person who wanted war.
No.
But still, strangely enough, that's what we've got all the time, isn't it?
That's it.
Yeah.
And it's through war propaganda.
Yeah.
That somebody's evil out there, Milosevic or Saddam Hussein or
Exactly.
Bin Laden. And you know, they
Exactly.
always change. It's always a new Hitler. And you never see them.
But that brings me back to the role of the media, because they should tell us about all this stuff,
Yes.
shouldn't they? They shouldn't be manipulating the.
No, I think journalists should help to inform us. That's what they should. And what I have experienced with the issue of 9/11 is that journalists were very, very scared to report anything else that doesn't fit the story of Bush. You know, he said Bin Laden did it, so all the journalists went down and wrote, okay, Bin Laden did it. And I go, why do you write that? And he said, Bush said it. And I said, well, why do you trust him? And I said, you know, the other journalist writes the same thing. And I said, well, that's heck of a great reason.
Yeah.
And that's just what I've seen too many times. I don't think that journalists do bad reporting when it comes on, you know, who won the last championship football game.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah.
You know, that reporting is very good. I'm very happy. I like to read it. I think it's entertaining. It's well done. Or if they report on, you know, that there's a local club here in my neighborhood and that they're having an exhibition next week and that some young you know, teenagers present their new songs, which they've exercised. Perfect reporting.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about journalism as a whole.
I know, yeah.
I'm talking about the fact when it comes to terror and war. In these specific cases, now with the Ukraine, I just think it's very often the case that the media helps to portray a new enemy very strongly and heaps up, you know, the feeling of the population and makes them like, yes, it's now time to bomb Gaddafi, or it's time to bomb Putin, or it's time to bomb Saddam Hussein. Very strange. You wonder, how do they do it? And it's usually that they always say the position of the other guy is so wrong and he's so cruel that it's the only thing we've got to do is to kill him. And
It reminds me of Goebbels.
it is Goebbels. It is Goebbels. I have to tell you, I've studied Goebbels. This is Goebbels.
Yeah.
I've studied Goebbels.
Okay.
It's very simple. He says you can steer up people very quickly with a few things. I mean, look, he was a doctor of history. He was in a very similar position like I was. I mean, he was interested in the world. He was researching how people behave, what they do, and you know his cleverness. He used it to support Hitler.
Yeah.
That was a bad decision. But what is good about him is that you can show that he understood war propaganda. And it's not different today. No. This is Goebbels today, what we have. He said, first rule is, you need to create an image of the enemy that the average citizen thinks the enemy is so evil that we can't live with him. There's no way to compromise. He's so evil, there's only one solution, we have to kill him. So, be it the Soviet Union, be it the Jews, you have to take them on a level where people whisper, I think they eat their children for breakfast. Yeah. And when that rumor spreads, or when it goes like, they are just rats, and we hate rats. You have to lower. George Orwell, another very clever man, once said, the system of propaganda is the technique to make one human being forget that the other one is also a human being.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
A very good point. Yeah. And it's very true. It worked in the World War II. It worked in 1994 with the Hutu and the Tutsis in Rwanda, or even with the Rote Armee-Fraktion in Germany. You know, very, very thin line there. What they did is they said, Polizisten sind Schweine, which means policemen are pigs.
Yeah.
Now you say, okay, it's just they were angry and that's why they said it. No, no, it's very dangerous because pigs is what you slaughter, unless you're a vegetarian. But they said, well, we might as well slaughter them. We killed them. And this is very thin, this line. Goebbels explains it very well. First, it starts in the head. You go like, okay, now with Ukraine, the Russians are evil. They want to conquer everything. It's nothing to do with the facts, okay? NATO is expanding and the Russians are trying to stop NATO. That's the facts, but never mind. Our media, if I read it now, is like, Russian Putin wants to conquer the world. And then people get scared. And then you add a few stories of misdeeds, which you have in every society. You have misdeeds here in Switzerland. You can report them. You have misdeeds in Denmark. You can report them. And then people get all stirred up and think, there we have it. The misdeeds of Saddam Hussein, they're all evil people. We have to bomb them. And yes, unfortunately, I mean, it is not that we have overcome Goebbels. It's more that we have made it more perfect.
Yeah, exactly. I just saw a headline in the Wirtschaftszeitung this morning saying Putin is now the enemy of all Ukrainians. I mean, that's an example of what you're just saying
it's
about
just twisting the facts.
Building up, twisting the facts.
It's twisting the facts. I mean, what I wish is that the media would print such an article in the sense, let's print one article which says we all hate Putin and, do that story. And then on the other day, print a story which says NATO during the last 20 years has enlarged more and more and more to the Russian border, although they said they wouldn't do it, and say NATO is aggressive. Yeah. And then people can choose. They say, yesterday I read that Putin is bad. Today I read that NATO is bad. Tomorrow I read Putin is bad. Mm-hmm. Next day I read NATO is bad. And then in the end, they will start to make up their mind.
Exactly.
And I just wish that there was more balanced. I mean, when Obama was elected the second time, I was invited by Swiss television to have a debate on the United States. Mm-hmm. It was the question of loved or hated. USA, loved or hated. Delicate question, good question. Delicate. I said, yes, I can come. It was a talk show, 1 hour. And the American ambassador was also invited. So when he said, yes, America is just a great empire, no, not empire, sorry, a great country, and I said, yes, I was in the United States, and, there's many things I like. The Americans, they take something as a challenge, they always go like, yes, let's do something new, and there's a problem, let's solve it, okay? Whereas here in Switzerland, we often go like, let's not take any risks. And so I like this. American style. Also, if you look at lectures at universities in America and you look lectures at here, they're much more entertaining in America.
Okay. Yeah.
But there are other things which I don't like at all. And that's just the bombing of other countries and the killing and the torture. This is no good. So I told the American ambassador, I gave him a list of the countries they bombed. I said, after 1945, there's no other country which has bombed so many countries. Let's stick to the facts. In 1950, you bombed North Korea, okay? In 1953, you overthrew the government of Iran. You used bombs. In 1954, you overthrew the government of Guatemala. You used explosions and bombs, what have you. In 1964, you started the Gulf of Tonkin incident and started the Vietnam War with 3 million dead. In 1961, you made the Bay of Pigs invasion. You tried to invade Cuba. It didn't work, but you tried. Then you continued during the Vietnam War to bomb Cambodia, which was an illegal act because Cambodia was a neutral country at the time. Yeah. But Nixon manipulated the flight pass. Then in 1979, you started with the Saudi Arabia to fund radical Muslims in Afghanistan, which dragged in the Soviet invasion, 1979. In 1973, you overthrew the government of Chile. In 1982 or 83, you invaded Grenada. Just a tiny little place where you go like, why did Grenada do anything against you? In the 1980s, you supported the Contras in Nicaragua, which were brutal. They killed women and children, and you funded that with the money that you took from weapon sales in Iran.
Exactly.
So Iran-Contra.
Yeah.
At the same time, you supported Saddam Hussein, who was aggressing Iran. Saddam Hussein at the time was a friend of the West, so he got all the weapons and everything, so he could attack Iran. So a few 100,000 people there who were killed. In 1989, you invaded Panama. In 1991, you had the Iraq Desert Storm, Kuwait.
Yes.
1993, you bombed Libya. No, 86, you bombed Libya. And 1993, you bombed Sudan. Then it just goes on. In 1995, you bombed Bosnia, the area there with the war in Yugoslavia. In 1999, you bombed the Kosovo. You bombed Serbia. In 2001, we had 9/11, and then you went on to bomb Afghanistan. Yeah. And it didn't end there. After Afghanistan, you started to attack in 2003 the Iraq with more than 100,000 people killed. That didn't stop the thing. In 2011, you started to bomb Libya. I mean, wrap your mind about it. You have a serious violence problem. This is, it's not. I'm not being picky here. If the Soviet Union or if the Russians or the Chinese were doing the same thing, I would tell the Chinese ambassador exactly the same thing. I mean, they occupied Tibet and everything. They had Tiananmen. I'm not saying they're saving the world, but as a Swiss historian, I'm looking at the different countries of the world. It's 200 countries, and I'm wondering which country has bombed most countries during the last 70 years. That's a scientific question. And the answer, with a lot of clarity, is the United States.
Yes.
And so when I'm communicating to Americans, I ask them what they think about it. And it's very difficult for them to understand it, because they usually say, we do it to help.
But probably 2/3 of the wars you just mentioned, the average American has long forgotten.
Oh, yes.
So it's again the media always filling in new material for your mind to be occupied.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. What is your in the present situation? I mean, we're all told we're all concerned about Ukraine and Turkey and all this stuff. Do you have any opinion on the development regarding the oil factor again?
Yes. I mean, my thing is, I want to help that in the 21st century we have less wars, that we have less false flag, and this work is information warfare. So, like the Pentagon is doing information warfare, so academics have to start to do information warfare. We have to use information and state clearly what our results are. We cannot just stay silent. We have to speak truth to power. It's a bit difficult because we're small, right? Yeah. We don't have any nuclear bombs. We have no aircraft carrier. We just have books. And we have interviews and we have public lectures. That's what I'm giving a lot of public lectures right now. I get a lot of requests for public talks. The second thing what I'm doing is I'm researching the oil issue. And I found out that in many countries, the oil production is going down. That's the peak oil issue. I have a graph here where you see how oil production went up during the last 160 years. And we're now in an area where oil is on a plateau, and it will go down. And when it goes down, the resource wars will intensify. Yeah. Unless we shift to renewable energies, that will not be enough. At the same time, to free information structures. Yeah. So we must rid ourselves of that, there's only one way, we must have more bombs and we must kill more people. Okay, we have it all the time. Okay, as a human being, if you have dignity, at one point you have to say, I switch it off. I turn away. You cannot always say, I blame them, they lied to me. Switch it off. It's your decision.
But to get there, we need new media, don't we?
Yes.
A new media culture.
That's it. I mean, people. It's a different step thing. First, people have to realize that they were lied to in specific instances. I always say World Trade Center 7 on 9/11. That's a good wake-up call. Check on whatever media you're using, how they informed you on that issue. If they didn't inform you on that issue, poor performance. Then search for alternative structures and switch. Don't stay with the same structure. Switch. I always switch. I take this, I take that from different corners. And then third, talk with your friends. Talk with your friends about the real things that matter, that you care about, and ask them how they use and transform information. So the main research line that I now pursue in the 21st century, I'm now 41, I have 20 years to go or 30 years to go. Don't know how long, you have the energy to do research, but I will really help those people who are building sustainable structures. Like they build photovoltaic cells, they build resilient networks, they try to reduce hatred among different groups. And that's what I work on.
Yeah. So based on your experience and your current world view, where do you see the problems, the current problems regarding this oil factor, this oil war on oil, or?
I personally think that the war for oil and gas will continue, unfortunately. So we need to get into a new system where we don't depend on oil and gas that much anymore, because otherwise, as addicts, we're just connected to these wars. I think these wars will be fought in the Persian Gulf and elsewhere. So the countries surrounding the Persian Gulf, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, are obviously center stage because there's a lot of oil and gas there. Russia has a lot of oil and gas. It is, together with Saudi Arabia, the biggest producer of oil today, 10 million barrels every day. And just recently, all the pipelines that go out of that area, obviously pipelines going through Syria, people try to attack the area. If you look at just very recently, there was a conversation which was made public by members of the Turkish government, and they were talking about, let's have some false flag incident, create a casus belli, so we can say the Syrians did it and start a war with them and drag the Americans and NATO with us. It's just, it's now as we speak. It just goes on and on.
You think this danger is for real?
Yes. Out of the world population, it's less than 1%, the people who create wars, and but it's not only Americans, it's also Turkish or French or Israeli or British or Chinese or Russian, or they're in all different places. It's just a way of using power and abusing power, and it is hard to document for us as historians. It's very hard, but on a positive note, if I can sum it up, I think we must leave oil, we must leave gas, we must leave coal, and we must leave nuclear energy. These are the 4 non-renewable energy sources. We must leave them. It will be difficult and will take many years. But we must go towards wind, we must go towards sun, water, geothermal energy, biomass, efficiency. And we must use our brain and our technology and our skills not to produce more weapons, not to produce more propaganda, but to have sensible, well-balanced, clear-cut information and technology that is sustainable, that helps us to have water, to have food, to have a sensible living structure. And I think there's more and more people now in the 21st century who want that, because the problem is evident, and the solutions are also here. That's what I like. On my house, I put 60 square meters of photovoltaic. I had gas, for my heating. I took it out. I don't want it anymore. I put a heat pump. You drill holes into the earth twice 100 meters. Now I have this heat pump. I have wood, I have windows, which are 3 glasses, so it's very well isolated. I use solar thermic, so heat from the sun. So if I take a shower, it's heated by the sun. I don't need the gas from Gazprom. I don't need it. And
so we should actually all walk the talk, shouldn't we?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
We can do it. We can change this ourselves. Can't
yes. Somebody told me if you don't act, you have not really understood.
Right. Dr. Ganser, I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
Excellent.
Excellent.
This was